valuable species to your lawns are, it's a really fun thing to do, and it's I think it's a worthwhile pursuit. So in addition to maybe having kind of a strategy where you're kind of cutting back the unwanted weeds before they go to seed and letting your native plants go to seed, you also can kind of incorporate new plants. And maybe that might be, you have a hole that you dug up like a dandelion out of or something like that, and then you can replace it with a native plant. You can definitely do that. You just need to kind of make sure that you are understanding that this, giving your native plant that you add enough competitive advantage so it doesn't get overtaken by weeds. So if you have kind of a sparse, dry lawn with lots of bulb patches, actually that's a really good situation to add new plants into it, because there's lots of native plants that are drought tolerant and will do well in those kinds of situations. And it's a place where, rather than a wet, sunny area where the weed competition is really high, I wouldn't probably attempt it in an area like that, but you can plant into a lawn in a drier area that's kind of a little bit more sparse. So, you can think about targeting, using plants that are larval hosts that host the butterfly, the caterpillars of the butterfly and moth species that you would like to attract. Pollinator plants that have maybe even flowers that have a long season of bloom or bloom at different times to support pollinators throughout the entire season. And then you want to think about really tough plants that can tolerate a lot of what would happen in a lawn, like foot traffic, oftentimes drought. You don't want to have to be watering those plants a lot, because that would kind of take away from kind of leading into a more sustainable garden. Plants that are tolerant of poor soils, that don't have a lot of nutrition in them, that could be, that might not have a lot of organic matter in them. So even compacted soils, and plants that can handle some kind of mowing regularly if you want to keep them low. So here's a nice list of species that I'm not going to talk about every single one, but that, species that I think would be really lovely incorporated into lawns. And you don't have to furiously write these down, because I have sent out a PDF of the slideshow that I think if the Hollis Conservation Commission would like to send out to everybody, that would be great. And then you can all have this as a resource. But here's a number of native species. I'll talk about several of them for a few more minutes. So when you're planting into either that kind of sheet mulch, which is kind of starting more like with a blank canvas, or you're planting into maybe a barren lawn, you can think about grouping different native species together that like the same habitat and conditions. So always think about the soil moisture and the sunlight. What are the requirements of this plant does it need full sun, at least 6 hours of sunlight a day? Can it handle some partial sun, about 2 to 4 hours a day? Or is it really, really shade tolerant, and does it actually not do very well in the sun? All of these native plants in this little guild here are, very great in kind of full sun, and actually do best in full sun. And then they require well-drained, oftentimes sandy or gravelly soils that don't, get saturated, that don't stay wet, and actually they're very drought tolerant plants that can handle if it doesn't rain for a good long time during the summer. So three-toothed cinquefoil, like I mentioned before, plantain-leaved pussy toes, a nice ground hugger with really nice gray-green foliage, and that contrasts nicely with the cinquefoil, and then flax-leaved aster. And also what you can see here is that we have a long season of blooms. So in this photo, you see them all blooming at the same time, but pussy toes is an early spring bloomer, cinquefoil blooms kind of later in the spring, and then flax-leaved aster blooms in the fall. So building a guild of plants is building a guild of, maybe 3 to 5 species or so that have like the same kind of conditions, the sunlight and moisture, and then also kind of complement each other in terms of their temporal interest and pollinator value. And will complement each other visually too. So just to give you some better visuals of all those different species in that little guild, there's the larval host plant, plantain-leafed pussy toes. There's lots of other different species of pussy toes, and there's a little leaf pussy toes featured here. But they're called pussy toes because they have these really fuzzy flowers and then even more fuzzy seed heads that are like the underside of a cat's paw. They're a larval host, so they attract actually the American lady butterfly and the painted lady butterfly, both really gorgeous, closely related butterflies that lay their eggs on the leaves of pussy toes in the spring. And then the caterpillars actually stay tucked into the leaves and will form this kind of protective webbing around themselves, and then munch the leaves for a good portion of the spring. Now you might see, if you have pussy toes, that they get kind of crinkled and munched up by late spring, but that won't last forever. Once those caterpillars are big enough, they'll pupate and then emerge into these beautiful butterflies that become pollinators. So it doesn't mean that, the foliage won't regrow. But I think this is a really nice lesson to point out that, having munched leaves in your garden is not a bad thing. In fact, it usually means that they're supporting life, and not everything that eats your plants are pests. Actually, the vast majority of these species are just species dependent on these particular plants to survive. So this cinquefoil is a nice contrast to the fuzzy gray-green leaves of the pussy toes, that shiny leaf, and it also has kind of narrow foliage. And it's an alpine plant that will grow straight out of a crack of a rock, on bare ledge, at the top of a mountain. I've seen it close to the top of Mount Washington. And then it also can be used kind of as a nice edging plant for the edge of a sidewalk, or as a ground cover in that way. But it can easily get outcompeted by taller plants. So you want to put it somewhere where there won't be other, weeds or other species that will kind of take over. And it's in the rose family, so it has kind of a rose-like flower and attracts a lot of pollinators when it blooms in spring. Then the flax-leaved aster, the third in that guild, is an aster that's a really great garden aster. It's very tidy and upright and short. It doesn't usually get taller than 8 and maybe 12 inches at the very most. So it's nice and low, another great edger. And it blooms prolifically in the fall, and followed by the blooms, it has these kind of fuzzy seed heads and really nice fall foliage, which is very unusual for a lot of perennials. It turns shades of salmon and yellow and green. And just feeling the leaves, they're kind of like flax, or they're stiff. So that's why it's called flax-leaved stiff aster. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but they have a really beautiful kind of texture to them. And I also just want to make a case for asters and goldenrods being really important plants to incorporate in any garden project and every garden project, because they are really important late season forage for native bees. A lot of native bees are, looking to store energy before they either go dormant and hibernate, or, make sure that they can store energy for their brood for the next season and lay eggs. Or they also, during the growing season, are incredible larval host plants. So asters and goldenrods will host hundreds of species. They're kind of up there with the oaks and the other trees, and hosting a lot of different caterpillar species. So a nice kind of fall winning combination is gray goldenrod, which is a more tidy, short goldenrod. There's a number of different smaller petite goldenrods that are really great for the garden, that are very different from, I think most of the goldenrods we see in large fields and on the roadsides are either the Canada goldenrod or the wrinkle leaf goldenrod, or a couple other species that tend to kind of form large colonies and push out other species. They're still nice native species that are important for wildlife, but those can be kind of relegated to the larger pastures and areas to be planted, while this garden-worthy goldenrod, the gray goldenrod, is really great mixed with purple lovegrass, which is a nice fall bloomer, and their colors contrast each other really well. And gray goldenrod has this kind of like very, stout, upright stem with a little bit of a fuzz on it that gives it a grayish color. And that's why it's called gray goldenrod. But I think it's one of the latest blooming goldenrods, and it has kind of a more electric yellow than a lot of other species. And incorporating other kinds of plants into lawns like spring ephemerals, like the eastern shooting star, just adds another layer of interest. These ephemerals are called ephemeral because they come up in the growing, the early part of the growing season before the leaves have come out on the deciduous trees, and they take advantage of that extra light, and they do their photosynthesizing, they flower, they get pollinated, and then usually they die back to the ground, and sometimes later on they send up these seed heads in the growing season, but mostly they're nowhere to be found after the first 6 weeks or so of spring. So eastern shooting star is a lot like that, and it's pollinated by bumblebees with this kind of special buzz pollination technique to shake the pollen out and get it into their leg baskets. And they look like inside out, upside down flowers or shooting stars. And they're just absolutely gorgeous. They can be kind of in shades of, white to dark pink. And you can incorporate them into lawns or into garden spaces to kind of layer them in, kind of like you do with a bulb, like a tulip, or an ephemeral like snowdrops. So it's a lot like that. So running groundsel is a very versatile ground cover. It can handle both sun and shade and dry and moist sites. And it's mostly a ground kind of hugger most of the time. Only in the spring it sends up shoots that are flowering stalks that, bloom about 8 inches off the ground or so. And it's a very cheery plant. It combines well with red columbine, which, favors some of the similar conditions and is also very versatile. And red columbine will, bring in hummingbirds and butterflies and all sorts of pollinators. So this is a view of golden groundsel from kind of the top. You can see that the foliage kind of knits together because it spreads vegetatively. And that's a really great kind of characteristic because it works really well underneath kind of taller, lankier stems of tall perennials like Joe Pyeweed or Culver's root, penstemons, or shrubs or, trees, and then kind of fills in that ground layer. And it really does benefit from a little extra shade given by those taller plants in the middle of the growing season. There's a couple of different species that you can really blend nicely in with grasses and, not necessarily just rely on those broadleafed plants to incorporate into your lawn, but things like the blue-eyed grass, which is in the iris family. And it's actually kind of like a miniature iris. It does favor kind of moist, well-drained soils, maybe not as wet as a true iris. But just like an iris, it has kind of 3 and 6 parted flowers and the 3 chambered kind of seed capsules and a flattened leaf base. So it looks a lot like iris if you kind of look up close. But most of the season, it looks just like a grass with the kind of really narrow foliage. And then about kind of late spring, it pops out a lot of flowers and will just kind of subsequently keep spitting out flowers the rest of the growing season. And they look, when they're in a mass, like they're kind of hovering within the grass. It's really beautiful. And they're easy to add into a number of places. They do, with these kind of dry seed capsules, they seed around quite vigorously, but they're so delicate of a plant that I really like seeing it kind of pop up in a number of places. And that's a really good way to kind of help make sure that your plant is moving around and taking up space on your site. A similar kind of looking plant, this is a much more up close image, is yellow stargrass, which has a similar feel, kind of a grass-like blade leaf and then these little flowers, and it incorporates really well into lawns. I'd say with this one, it can do much better in kind of more sandy or rocky soils, and doesn't need as much moisture as the blue-eyed grass. And in the shade too, you can think about incorporating layers of native plants and ground covers. I really like this example here because it incorporates a lot of beautiful woodland wildflowers underneath these sugar maples. Things like woodland phlox and bloodroot and Solomon seal and Christmas fern, and I'm sure countless others that you just can't see at this point during the season that will come up later or that have already come up and flowered. For instance, the bloodroot comes up. It's one of the first plants to flower in the spring. It has these really unusual shaped leaves, these broad leaves that kind of come out much later than the flower. And the flower is a beautiful white flower that drops its petals very quickly. Its seeds are actually pollinated by ants, along with a lot of other spring ephemerals and wildflowers too, because ants are kind of some of the main dispersers in the woodland ecosystem. And Canada Mayflower is really great. It's, I think, paired with something like Pennsylvania sedge, you can see in this situation, Pennsylvania sedge is kind of more dispersed and loosely growing through and in and amongst this Canada Mayflower, which is a very delicate looking plant. Canada Mayflower can sometimes get confused with Lily of the Valley because it has a similar, type of leaf, and its flowers are a little bit more actually like a little fluffy and not like the bell shapes of Lily of the Valley. And then these are the fruits before they fully ripen to red. They're very beautiful during the season. It looks like a very delicate plant, but it can handle dry shade and moisture as long as it has acidic soils. And I like to draw inspiration from kind of just the forests that I walk around in on a daily basis. So I often see this kind of suite of plants with Canada Mayflower and Pennsylvania sedge and things like wild sarsaparilla, wintergreen and partridge berry. A lot of those plants just grow together already, and they are great for kind of a shady backyard or understory planting. And here's another one, the partridge berry, that would go really well with those other species. It works really well planted into moss, actually. And then another example of just kind of a nice kind of matrix of species where you have multiple species growing throughout in a mass throughout a whole area, and they kind of form a backbone or some consistent cohesive backdrop for other plants to kind of come up through. So in this photo, you have Pennsylvania sedge and yellow stargrass, which you can see is actually a lot smaller than it looked in that other photo. And even the common cinquefoil, which is a native species. There is a non-native cinquefoil that's a common lawn weed, but it's not really, it's another innocuous one. And then I want to end with a couple slides on bluets, one of my favorite plants. Bluets are, if you're lucky, they're a common lawn weed. And this is growing with wild strawberry. You can see the wild strawberry here is just, playing really well with the bluets because it's not taking over. And the bluets will bloom in spring for, a really long time. They bloom kind of successionally. They keep just spitting out more and more blooms, and they'll just keep going. I've even seen them blooming through the winter. And so I know that this could generate a lot of interest for bluets because they're so cute, so beautiful. But I just also want you all to be aware that bluets are really difficult to collect seed from, just because, especially in quantity, because since they bloom for a really long time, they also their seed doesn't all ripen at once. It kind of, one will ripen then another, and so you'd have to check them daily. They come in these little brown pods, papery pods, and then the seed will be either dark brown or tan inside, and you have to check and make sure it's the right color before you harvest it. and you kind of have to harvest each seed individually. So it's not easy to, find bluets in a nursery situation. And the best thing to do, I'd say, is if you happen to get them on our website, because we do sell native seeds. If you get them before they sell out, that's great. We don't have them up right now, but they usually go up for just maybe a couple days. And then they get sold out really quickly because we don't have a lot in stock. And they're in high demand. But I'd say the best thing to do is if you do happen to have them in your lawn, they do grow well in lawns because they benefit from a regular mowing because it keeps the taller weeds out, which would shade them out. Then maybe collect some seed from them yourself. You can go and kind of learn a little bit more about what the seeds look like when they're ripe and try to start them from seed. And you can find more resources on our website about starting native plants from seed too. But bluets are relatively slow growing, and they form these small masses, which take a long time to get big. So you definitely don't want to kind of dig them up or wild harvest them. And that's the same with any of our native species, because it could just deplete their populations, and we really don't want that to happen. So I'll end with thinking about, when you do go out to buy some of these different species, find some really good local nurseries. There's a number of great nurseries in New Hampshire and all around New England. In New Hampshire, I think even just, Van Berkom is a great nursery. You can't buy directly from them, but they sell at a lot of retailers around New England. And Bagley Pond Perennials, Catherine Gardens, and as well as the New Hampshire State Forest Nursery. And we have lots of other resources on our website about kind of navigating the nurseries, because there's definitely a lot of things to look out for. But generally, when you go to a nursery to buy a native plant, first of all, ask to see if they have a good native plant selection and which of the plants are native, because they might not label that. And request that the plants are, that you really just want to be buying plants that are grown without harmful pesticides. This is important because, thinking about all the larval, all the caterpillars and butterflies and moths and bees and other insects that use these plants, they're eating them. And certain pesticides can kind of stay in the plant tissues for a really long time, up to several years after you've gotten them home and planted them. So really avoid getting plants from places like Home Depot or big box stores, because those are almost certainly grown with pesticides. And if you can, give it a try, grow your own native plants from seed. So I think I forgot to mention in the beginning of the talk that, Wild Seed Project is one of our main things is that we want people to learn how to grow native plants from seed, because seeds are, something that holds a unique genetic material, and each native plant grown from seed is very different from the next one. So they have this potential within their genes to adapt to different environmental stressors like pests and diseases, drought and flooding, all those things that can come with climate change, and make the populations of those plants much more resilient. So growing your native plant from seed yourself is a really fun thing to do. You can actually start a lot of seeds right now. Mostly the seed window has passed. We like to emphasize growing your native plants from seed from late November through the month of January, but there are some species that you can sow later than that, especially the asters and the bee balms and goldenrods, and the coneflowers too. But it takes a process, but it's a fun and low-tech thing to do. You can sow your seeds into a small pot with kind of compressed soil just on the surface of the soil. Then you cover them with a nice dusting of sand and water them in. And then you put them outside and cover them with something like hardware cloth, something metal, so that a small teeny tiny rodent like a mole couldn't get in and eat the seeds. You let the seeds actually get covered in snow and go through freezing and thawing. This is really important because native seeds, actually, most of them need this cold and moist stratification period so that they can break their hard seed coats and germinate the following spring. Some take a couple years to germinate, but most will germinate the following spring. And then you can grow them on during the growing season next year, divide them up, and then plant them into the ground and start your own little native seed nursery just in your backyard without taking up very much space. So it's a lot of fun, and I encourage you all to do so. So if you want to find more resources, definitely check out the PDF. It will be emailed to you. And here's a little bit more from Wild Seed as well. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer questions now.